Hey everyone, just getting set up.
Hello.
Hello?
Hey, boy.
Okay, all right, good. Give me about 2 seconds. Or 2 minutes, actually. Okay. Let's see. A pretty good group. Let's give about 2 more minutes. In the Zoom meeting link. One second. Rob, can you ping the Zoom meeting link? Then we close. Okay, so welcome to the January 9th meeting. Thanks for joining on short notice. Last meeting, we sort of discussed how there's actually quite a few topics, and the current cadence probably won't be sufficient, so we're just going to get started with weekly meetings for January until the foreseeable future. We want to cover, and in last meeting, and we alluded to in the previous meeting, we would have specific like deep dive topics. So the one for this one will be on basically the personas that we have kind of articulated in the sketch, sort of discuss them, see if everyone kind of generally is okay with those sort of user flows. And then the resource model, so there's a couple things to discuss sort of with respect to the personas, and then also we would like to cover gateway class, I think, which is probably the least controversial, so we can just kind of say, hey, we generally agree on the shape of gateway class. Hopefully the results of these meetings is some sort of general consensus on, okay, either the API has these problems and we need to fix it in further discussion, what are the major open items, or hey, we generally agree on the shape of things, so then we can move on to the next topic. And of course, the schedule that's there is not meant to be like, we have to close the topic at this time. If it overflows, then it'll overflow. I'm pretty sure some of the topics may end up having multiple sessions. So let me pull up the meeting agenda. By the way, are there any questions on that? I know this is like a big con call. Hopefully my audio is on.
No, it sounds good.
Okay. Let's see. I think this will work. I hope. Can people see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I just wanted to, that was kind of an update on the meetings last week. Also, at that time, people were asking about how the releases will work. So maybe Rob can give a update as we discussed it with Jordan in SIG-Arch.
Yeah, can you hear me from here?
You guys might want to
Okay,
come closer.
All right, so there's already a open source issue around what a CRD should look like that's somewhat official. And the only thing that exists that's similar to this so far is volume snapshot, and Jordan pointed us in that direction to show how CRDs could work in an official sense. And CRDs that are official need to be tied to KEPs, but do not need to be tied to Kubernetes versions or the Kubernetes release cycle. They're completely independent. Versioning should be very well thought out, similar to Kubernetes proper, in that we should have multiple alphas release often on that front. But once we get to beta, get as stable as we possibly can before we get there, because version changes at that point will become significantly more complex. Once we want end users to actually be using this, we want this to be as stable as possible because API changes become difficult. And yeah, conversion between different versions is not as straightforward as we would hope. And although volume snapshot CRDs could be installed directly by CSI drivers, it doesn't quite work the same way for us because we're going to want at least to support multiple ingress controllers in a single cluster. So we'll have to have a slightly different installation process. And that is probably worth a different issue in and of itself, just to figure out the smoothest way to install this going forward.
Yeah, I think at least for the alpha, these are not pressing issues.
Yeah.
We would just ask the users to update to the latest
Right.
branch, and then all the controllers, they will support it at some level.
Right.
It's not expected that it's just like
Yeah.
inter-compatible, but definitely by beta, it should be pretty, like,
Yeah.
the bar is much higher.
Yeah.
So bottom line is that we can iterate fast for now,
Yeah.
and we'll just stay in alpha. And then at some point when we graduate to beta, that will be when we have to sort of make these sort of bigger moves in terms of compatibility. If anyone is interested in helping out here, like, what do you think is the next steps required?
That's
about it.
Yeah, I think that's about it for this. I can't think of obvious next steps until we actually have more progress on the APIs themselves, and they're closer to implemented.
Yeah, and I put a note that we should just write this up in the docs.
Yeah.
For how to do releases. Any questions on that? I think it matches what kind of our expectations was in terms of release cadence. Richard, I know you put a little blurb in there as well.
Yep, I think it's good.
Okay, all right. So on to the next topic. So today I kind of want to discuss sort of the roles, just to go over them and sort of solicit feedback. I know we went over this several times, but here, let me go back to this. But sort of in an open forum, and then have people kind of comment on this. So let's see. How do we contribute? Where it is. Okay. So the could just go to here. So the general conceit is that we have kind of a separation between people who could potentially create sort of classes of different kinds of proxies. And in fact, this maps very well to coexisting controllers, like in a cluster, for example, if you had the cloud controller and then say off-the-shelf controller 1 and off-the-shelf controller 2 and so on. So like everyone can coexist using gateway class, just like the volume class. And then there's a separate cluster operator, and that would be controlled by the infrastructure provider, or you could deploy your own, but that would be sort of have different permissions, and those would be granted. Also, you have the cluster operator who operates the cluster and controls sort of network access, and they may have the permissions to create and update gateways, but not necessarily give that permission to the application developer itself. And then finally, for the application developer, they would have permissions to create routes and, of course, services in their own namespaces, but not necessarily be able to manipulate gateways, and for sure, manipulate gateway classes. I kind of wanted to, I know that we had this at KubeCon a couple times, but kind of wanted to get everyone's sense of these are sort of the things that will appear in sensible RBAC policies that people can use, and does this map to what you guys are seeing in terms of your usages? And then if not, we should write down like what kind of are the gaps, and then sort of we can discuss them.
Hi, this is James. For RBAC, though, you know, you're RBACing on accounts and roles, right?
Yes.
You're not doing RBACing based on the gateway class and stuff like that. So isn't RBAC orthogonal to this structure?
Well, you have to RBAC, the noun in RBAC is the resource. So you kind of have to break it down by resource if you want to use RBAC. For example, I can give users the ability to manipulate gateways in a certain namespace, users or roles, right? Because there's another level of indirection where you go from users to roles. But let's say you give a given role permission to manipulate gateways in a particular namespace. You have to put gateway in there. I guess you could say every resource, but usually people restrict it based on the resource.
Oh, I see what you mean, just in terms of RBACing gateways.
For instance, you probably want to restrict gateway class, creation of gateway classes to admins, or manipulation of gateway classes to admins.
So where we are now, the kind of the equivalent of this in Ingress is just the Ingress class string, right?
Yes.
You just have these well-known strings which do the functional equivalent of gateway class and also your controller YAML.
Right, although that's changing with the GA in that the Ingress class itself is also going to be its own resource, and that will be a resource reference. There's some transition where the raw name can be used, but the idea is in long term there will be actually a resource that maps to sort of the parameters that you give the controller. In this model, we kind of bring that forward as well, in that you can define gateway classes, right? Your controller authors will define gateway classes.
Okay, so one of the things that one of the capabilities that breaking it down this way gives you then is the ability to specify per gateway configuration for your controller.
Given gateway classes.
Right.
Yes, I guess.
You could go, well, for this gateway, I want gateway class A, and gateway class A is controller B with, parameters 1, 2, 3.
That's right.
And gateway class, F is controller B. I forgot my letters, but it's the same controller with a different set of parameters.
Yeah, that's right. So the expectation is that you won't have such a heterogeneous, like from the infrastructure provider's standpoint, they will provide a given set of classes. The most obvious being like this one runs Nginx, this one runs Envoy, this one is integrated with the cloud. And of course we can break it down like this cloud one is the expensive one, this is the cheap one, and so forth. So like the expectation is that from an infrastructure provider standpoint, it won't be like one gateway has its own unique config. It's more like there will be some that are offered. It just makes it easier for the user to consume.
The gateway could be, the gateway class could be implemented by one controller or many controllers. Right? There could be multiple gateway classes on a single controller for different configuration settings.
Yeah. So the gateway class is somewhat indirected from the actual controller itself. So actually, if we want to, we can dive into gateway class since we've been talking significantly about it. Do you guys want to do that, or do you guys?
Okay. I would like that.
Okay, let's just do that. So, if you've been watching the repo, there's been some activity here. Mostly it's to try to like sync up the sketch so we can have something code-wise to look at. But so here we have gateway class. So first, it's an incomplete sentence there. So the first thing is that gateway class seems to feel like it should be a cluster level resource rather than namespace resource. So that's one decision point I think that we should all think about. And then the second is that, at least currently in the sketch, we basically you have a gateway class and it has a controller. By the way, can everyone read this? I'm gonna make it way big.
Yeah, it looks good to me.
Okay.
Yeah, same here.
That's good, yeah.
Okay, so so gateway class has a controller, which is a string, which is, in this case, is acme.io gateway-controller. And so basically, multiple gateway classes can map to one controller. For example, acme.io has a gateway controller, and you can actually, the infrastructure provider can then, given the different parameters, define sort of how this controller works for association with a given gateway class. Now, the parameters is going to be completely up to the implementation. We don't, at least at this point, I don't know of any like common stuff. Maybe given experience, we can always take the common stuff and sort of like pick it into the gateway class structure. But basically, this is like a opaque object that will be consumed by the individual controller. Yeah. And I think for a given gateway class, there will only be one controller. I think that should be an invariant, that we won't have multiple controllers fighting over a single gateway class. But a given controller can obviously have more than one gateway class.
Hey, Bo, can you help me understand, because I see it with parameters here as well as in the gateway type, that we're using a type local object reference
I see.
as opposed to an object reference. So if this is, you know, a cluster scoped resource, I don't understand how that can be a type local object reference since it's expected to be in the same namespace. And same with gateway, where my understanding was that a gateway should be able to be bound to routes from different namespaces.
That might be just, I used the wrong type there when I.
Okay.
But I thought okay, so maybe you know better than me, like the cluster resources, if it was parameters as a cluster CR, then would you use a type local or would you use an object reference? Object reference seems to be like the most generic.
Yeah, you know, for cluster scope, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe it's just something we can test and.
Object appropriate for referring to both or either namespace or cluster scope resources.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Probably, it's more like whatever is less verbose, I think, is that why you would use more specific references. Do you know? Like, why would you prefer one type versus the other, apart from verbosity, maybe? Does anyone know? Oh, maybe we should.
Is it a bike shed? I don't know. Right now, at least. So.
Yeah, that's true. Anyways, this is something that we can fix later on.
Okay.
But any comments on sort of the general layout of gateway class?
I think one thing that I wanted to point out or rather ask is if let's say you take any of the reverse proxies as an example, then you would have to create a gateway class, but then you would also have to create this object reference. And should that be a CRD or can we be as simple as a config map? Because we also want to limit the number of CRDs that we want to ask users to install just to set up an ingress controller.
Yeah, given it's an object reference, it could conceivably be a config map. In fact, maybe we should just say that the actual type is up to the controller.
And should we enforce some standardization here or not? Just for a simpler approach where people can, like, if you're installing 5 CRDs for the controller and this one is being also installed, and there is no interoperability at all. So
yeah, that one, it would really be useful for everyone here to kind of figure out what would go into this config map, and maybe we can see what the commonalities are. It's kind of hard right now without the concrete examples to sort of, I didn't want to put anything in. It was just like,
I think the way you put it, Bowie, like just saying that for now, at least, that like you said, that we'll just treat it as opaque for now, and we can revisit that later. I think just treating it as opaque doesn't seem to impede us from continuing beyond it at this point, I think.
yeah, this is one that as the alpha goes along, I think it will be more obvious, the answer. Right now, probably, unless you have something that's very obvious that comes to mind. For me, it's like if I looked at all the different controllers and their configs, it's actually like pretty diverse what you can configure.
yeah, this is just too diverse. It's just the doubt here is just to keep it a little simpler, where like installing custom resources is also kind of a pain. Like there are projects which do like 20 custom resources. That's all. So I think we can revisit this later.
But just since it just happened a second ago, and I want to note it before I forget. Bowie, you had stated you had outlined an invariant with regards to the class name, and how we can use that to avoid having fighting controllers. That seems like, for me as an implementer, like that kind of invariant, like clearly stated, is really useful. And I would just appreciate if we could like write down somewhere. I don't know where it really belongs now, but I just want to kind of keep track of that as like an important point.
Yeah, we'll probably put that in the API spec section. We're still trying to figure out what the best format for API spec, like
yeah, sure.
Most, for example, C++ spec is like. So we want to avoid that, but yeah, we're still trying to figure that out. But that's kind of something that we would probably put in the spec, or actually we.
But is it one? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Is it one controller or one controller type? Right. I mean, we could have multiple, let's say, Envoy gateway controllers as part of this particular gateway class. So it's not necessarily like one controller, but it's like one controller type.
I see. By controller, I'm talking about some abstract thing that's like self-consistent, not necessarily. It depends on what you mean by controller, but basically it's like when you configure it, you know that the responsibility is very well defined, as opposed to say mapping it to say like pods or something, right? Like from the user standpoint, or actually from the controller standpoint, it's not ambiguous like who is going to be manipulating it. We don't expect that let's say you installed software A and software B, different, like one is Nginx, one's Envoy, like you don't expect them to kind of clash.
So a controller can have multiple gateway classes, but a gateway class can only belong to a single controller.
Or should be controlled by a single controller.
Yeah, should be that. Okay.
Stated another way, could you say then that there's, at any point in time, there's only one controller in the cluster that's consuming gateway classes of a certain type?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Only one at a time. Resource. Okay, great.
Another question, just to piggyback on what goes into gateway classes. A common source of confusion is because today's ingress controller themselves are also a class. If you're using any if you're not using any cloud provider, you have, let's say, Nginx Onward, any of the reverse proxies controllers, you have a class associated with them. So, and then that itself is a service. And then that service is of type node port, load balancer, whatever be it. Should that be something clarified in a gateway class, or that's something like in the parameters section, or is that something that it does not concern the gateway class at all?
That's a good question. How to best to write this down? So basically, you're saying that it's sort of okay. So what I'm hearing, and you can read, I'm going to rephrase your thing, is basically that should gateway class indicate to the user some aspects of how the thing works? Like, is it a load balancer service? Oh no. Is it a load balancer service? Is it is it a cloud provider? That's an interesting thing. It's worth, we should note it and discuss it, because, for example, if it's in the spec, what would you do with it? Would it be status? Would it be a piece of configuration that someone wants to then change? But for most of the providers, that's not a changeable thing. It's more like it is what it is, unless some of the folks here have examples where it can be changed.
So I think it's more like, so for cloud providers, it's pretty standard, right? Like cloud providers would spin up some kind of a load balancer and proxy traffic through that. For reverse proxy vendors, I think it's a mix and match, right? Some people, let's take Nginx Ingress, for example, then that can be deployed as a node port or a load balancer service. Then that itself can be like an internal load balancer versus an external one. And there, the possibilities are, there are a few possibilities to do, like possible ways to do that.
Right. I would like to, since putting it in the API means that someone's going to act on it. So putting it into status, even though gateway class currently doesn't have status, like putting it into status seems like, okay, this is information that we're going to tell the user about the infrastructure. Putting into class, oh, you're saying you want to control it because that's the controller itself is going to be sort of picking which implementation to use, or
that's sort of confusing, because for cloud providers, they can inspect this gateway class and based on that spin up a load balancer in a correct subnet or with some specific properties. But for reverse proxy vendors, they cannot do anything because they would usually have manifests which install the load balancer itself for the service, right? They cannot, like, let's say an Nginx Ingress controller itself won't be installing a service, right? The controller is installed by the user and is not installed by a provider.
So there's environment specific or deployment specific and user provided or admin provided parameters that determines the type of gateway class.
Yeah, I think this is worth throwing into the user stories doc and then maybe opening up an issue to discuss.
Yeah.
Because we have for a given API, we have to consider both who's going to consume it, who's going to edit it, and then what, from the user standpoint, like what they would do with it.
Yeah, because I think there's a question of, should gateway class be something that is just provided by the
infrastructure
proxy vendor, or to what degree should the admin be able to define their own out of something lower level that the vendor provides? Yeah, so that's something that user stories would help for.
Yeah, I think it's definitely the case that we want to, since we separated the controller, which is up here, from the class, is that the admin does sort of configure this for their users. The question would be like, should especially for the reverse proxy vendors, like should how it's being implemented be surfaced somehow, and then how? Yeah, so that's definitely worth pursuing. I would be curious to see the user story in terms of how, from the user standpoint, who's consuming the API, like how, like what knobs, kind of what information we want to expose.
Okay, I'll add a cloud provider user story and a reverse proxy vendor story, and then we can take it from there.
And then I think we should open
I have a question about this. Like, is the status somewhat opaque then as well from an API perspective? Because we don't-
Currently, there is no status for
right,
gate.
I'm saying if there were, like, would it necessarily be opaque, I guess, because we can't predict what form the implementation will want to present status into.
Yeah, that's the easiest thing to do, but I can see, given that there's already an ecosystem out there, is like it's either cloud in cluster, and then if it's in cluster, then we have standard Kubernetes mechanisms to talk about.
Mhm.
Again, let's try to like have the user.
Yeah, whether that belongs on the class, I still have questions about that, but I
Yeah.
don't want to bog it down again. Sorry. Thanks.
I think it might be on the gateway itself, because you can, for a given controller, they could, for example, have two load balancers, like, have a pool of them or something. It seems more like anything associated with sort of actual IPs being allocated resources, endpoints, those would kind of live on the gateway. But let's look at the user stories, because I'm pretty curious on like kind of how people would be using this information.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think OpenShift actually takes, I think, an approach similar to that with regards to like the router instances, which I guess you could say are roughly analogous to a gateway. So they'll publish details about themselves to routes they've admitted. But I'm also curious about the use cases that like they gave rise to that functionality, because I don't quite understand them yet.
Right. Any other thoughts on this topic?
I have one thought on parameters, which might be a little bike sheddy, but did you consider doing some kind of inline opaque JSON blob, like a raw is it a raw reference or something?
Yeah, if someone
that's-
wants to investigate raw references, which I think, as I understand it, if you send it to my reviewers, they like take you out back and like slap you around. But but we can discuss it. I don't think it's very well used, so I just don't know the sort of ins and outs of it.
I think Cluster API at one point used it or something like it. It just occurred to me based on Harry's concern around there being so many CRDs for
So
operators to manage.
Yeah, another interesting, these are all conceivably could be horrible, is like some kubectl support for inlining objects when you're editing them or something. That's another thing if you didn't want to actually do it in the type system. Or you could put annotations in the type system that are only consumed by CLI. So anyways, those are all interesting things. I know I put extensions at the very end of the topic, but we can start opening up issues and try to explore sort of what the ins and outs of those are. That was something that did come up, the use of sort of the raw JSON type. So if feel free to file an issue and then try to ask the API machinery folks what they think of it.
Okay, I'll file an issue on that.
Yeah, that was also something that was raised as a potential for just the extensibility blocks. But at least some conversations was that we should try hard to use CRs instead of just schemaless stuff. But it is nice to have things inline and be sort of self-consistent inside an object, because that's the only consistency model that Kubernetes gives us. So unfortunately, Zoom lets us, we're running out of time on the Zoom, but I think we made pretty good progress. Any last thoughts? I can reopen the Zoom meeting, hopefully, if we need to keep going.
I have one comment. Have you guys considered the naming collisions? Like multiple controllers can come up with a gateway class with the same name.
That's up.
Load balancer.
The thing is, that's up to the administrator to
Okay.
sort of suss that out. Like then your administrator kind of made a mistake.
But then let's say I want an NGX and Envoy, and then they both come up with load balancer gateway class.
Oh, but you have to edit that one. That's up to the infrastructure provider to make sure that there's no naming collisions. There's already that issue with class today, is which one is default and which one is named. And in fact, the infrastructure provider, at least for GKE, like I know that we make that choice. Like we explicitly say which one is the default. unless you want to register like OIDs. No one wants to do that. Okay, any final thoughts? Or actually, scream if you want me to elongate the meeting.
Should we just cover like an overview of gateway itself a little bit, just so that folks have time to go back and think more about how those two relate?
Okay, I'm going to see if Zoom lets me restart the meeting. Sorry about this. I need to get the Kubernetes account. All right, we'll be back. I'll be on Slack if this doesn't work out.
All right.